This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com.
Hi, I'm Cindy Harris, and in this episode, I'm going to share with you my recipe for banana bread. Banana bread is a wonderful quick bread that's great for breakfast, snacks, or even tea. To get started, I always like to get my loaf pan ready. You know, for many years, I didn't know about making a sling in a loaf pan, and I would sometimes have a real hard time getting breads out of the pan, but now that I use this sling technique, I never have any trouble. So let me show you how I do it. I have a piece of parchment here, and I'm going to fold it in half lengthwise like this. And then I'm going to turn it, and with a paring knife that is non-serrated, I'm just going to run that blade along the fold just like this and turn that one piece of parchment into two pieces of parchment. Now next I'm going to take some baking spray and I'm going to spritz the inside of my loaf pan, sides and bottom. Now when you have your parchment, you can see it's a little wide for my pan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the right width, and then I'm just going to fold that down like this, make a nice crease, and then again take my little paring knife and just run it along that seam. That way my sleeve fits right into the bottom of my loaf pan, and I just fold those edges over a little bit. And then I do one last quick little spritz on the inside. That's going to ensure that when I take this bread out using the sleeves, it'll come out perfectly. Your pan is ready to go. We can just set that off to the side, but don't throw this other piece of parchment away. We can use that either the next time we make a loaf of bread or just any time. You'd be amazed how these sort of unusual pieces of parchment can come in really handy. So I'm just going to put this back in my parchment drawer. Now we're going to go ahead and get our batter together. One of the things I love about quick breads is they're really quick. You get a great loaf of bread and it comes together really quickly in the mixer. So I'm going to start by getting half a cup of butter, and as always I'm going to cut it in lengthwise twice and then cut it up into little cubes and put my cubes into the mixer and get them starting to cream. The butter is starting to cream up nicely, and to that I'm going to add 1.5 cups of sugar. And I'm going to let this sugar and butter cream together for a couple of minutes so that they get nice and fluffy. Next we want to get our bananas in our batter, and I have 2 yellow bananas, and the bananas can be pretty far gone for banana bread, which is really nice. Now what I do is I take the banana while it's still in the skin and I run my hands around it. I'm almost pre-mushing it up before I get it into the mixer. Then I just peel it and put it right in, and it's already pretty mashed up. When I was a little girl making banana bread, the recipe always said you have to mash the bananas in a bowl with a fork before you put them in the batter, and I always thought, well, that seems like kind of a waste. Why don't you just mash it up in the skin? And sure enough, it turns out great that way. Once I get the banana in, I'm going to go ahead and let this mix in with the sugar and the butter. Then it's time for 2 eggs and a teaspoon of vanilla. Look how smooth that batter is. That's just perfect. I'm going to turn it off and start getting my dry ingredients together. For the dry ingredients, I'm going to mix this all together in a small bowl. So I'm going to first start by putting in 1.5 cups of flour, a teaspoon of baking soda. Now this soda, along with our sour cream, is what's going to give the lift to this banana bread. A half a teaspoon of salt, and with my little whisk, I'm going to whisk those ingredients together. And the last thing I'm going to add to my dry ingredients is a half a cup of chopped walnuts. And these are a fairly fine chop. I'm fortunate, one of the stores that I shop at, they actually sell walnut baking pieces, so these are already chopped up for me, which really makes a great time saver. And I'll whisk the walnuts in as well. Before we add our dry ingredients to the mixer, there's one more ingredient that we have to get ready, and this is actually what I think is my secret ingredient for this banana bread. It is non-fat sour cream. I need to measure out a half a cup of it. You know, non-fat sour cream is so great in baked goods because it gives a great moistness, but it doesn't add any fat and hardly any calories. In the mixer, I'm going to take all of my dry ingredients, including the walnuts, put that in, let that mix for just a couple of seconds, and then as soon as that starts coming together, I'm going to put in my half a cup of sour cream. And I'll let this mix until I don't see any more streaks of sour cream, and that's about it. It's important before we put the batter in our loaf pan that we take our spatula and give one final mix down. Again, these pockets of flour can be very tricky, and we definitely do not want any of that in our bread. So once we do a mix down, then we just pour it right into our loaf pan. Now the one thing about quick bread that's not so quick is the baking. Now you can see this is a lot of batter and it's very thick. So it's going to take a while to bake, up to an hour actually. So the other thing that's dependent is the type of loaf pan you're using. Now if I'm using a glass one today, so I would be baking this in a preheated 325 degree oven for about 55 to 60 minutes. If I were using a metal loaf pan, I would put the heat up to 350 degrees, again, letting it bake for about 55 to 60 minutes. Now, it does take almost an hour for these breads to bake, but here's what I do. I want to make sure that my quick bread does not get dried out. So at about the 55-minute mark, I take it out of the oven and I'll use a skewer to see if it's done. So let's go ahead and put it in our oven and let's get it cooking. So here is our banana bread, but we definitely want to test it. So I've got a long skewer. Normally I use a toothpick, but because this is so thick, I'm going to push it down in the middle. Now you can see there's still a little bit of creaminess on the skewer. So I'm going to put this back in the oven for about another 5 minutes. So let's test again. Cleaned off my skewer, pop it in the center, and that's clean all the way through. I'm going to let this bread sit here on the cooling rack in the pan for another 10 minutes. Now before we lift our bread out of the pan, I like to take my paring knife and just run it along the two long ends where there is no parchment sleeve, just to make sure that it'll release nice and easily. And then all I have to do is lift it up with my parchment sleeves and pull it right out of the pan. And see, nothing in the pan. I love that. Now this bread is going to need to cool on the rack for about an hour or so. Well, it's been just about an hour and this is cooled off nicely, and I've gone ahead and cut a slice out of it. Now for this bread I use a serrated knife. I find it cuts through a little bit easier, and you can see this bread has a wonderful texture to it. It's perfectly cooked all the way through and it's nice and moist. No dry banana bread here. Now this is a pretty big loaf of banana bread. If you had smaller loaf pans you wanted to use, you could absolutely do that. Fill them about 3/4 of the way full. Of course, you'd have to test them a little bit quicker in the baking process. I'd start maybe after 30 minutes or 35 minutes and just ease the time up a little bit, maybe starting at another 5 minutes or another 2 minutes. That way you'll never overbake your bread. Now, if you'd like to try this banana bread at home, just go to our website and go to the Daily Bread show notes, and I'll have the recipe there for you. And as always, if you have any questions, please send me an email. I'll see you next time.